Good, welcome back, and welcome to the first video micro lecture of the semester. We will have several of these. We'll have almost one per week. And the midterm and final will be based upon these micro lectures. Just make that clear up front. Well, for today, Blake's view of contemporary culture is one of our preoccupations, because you've already been interested in fact, all three of these topics: Blake's role as prophet, as well as Blake's view of nature, in addition to Blake's view of contemporary culture, by way of the discussion board. These are the three topics. They're keyed to, as I've stated them here, are keyed to the discussion questions. And they are related. Blake's sense of London, right, as contemporary culture at its worst, perhaps, okay? The prophet in him hears the problem, those mind-forged manacles of the mind, the imagination itself, which has lost touch with nature and been shaped, foreclosed, directed, chartered, as if it were a river flowing through a city whose course had been changed. You see how all this fits together, don't you? Blake sees a lot, he hears more. He hears the chain clinking. That's what he hears. At its kind of ultimate meaning of what he sees is something he can hear, which is the clinking of the chain. We'll have to ask what chain that is. Every time he sees a chimney sweeper or a soldier, hears a prostitute shriek. What is to be done? Well, you hear those chains clinking. Sing and dance, open your eyes and ears and other senses. Get back in touch with your body and go from there. Refuse the teachings, and here we get into these manacles that are forged by the mind, those mind forgings, those teachings of these various institutions in your culture, the church, the palace, what have you, which will try to create, hijacking and twisting your imagination thereunto. Something in you that is not natural, and that will get between you and your true needs. So we very much have in Blake this sense of, in each individual human as well as in the culture at large, the projections of this battle in each individual human between the mind and the senses, okay, your body, and the imagination that is much more on the side of your senses and your body, and the singing and dancing and imagining and dreaming and all those good things that we associate with romanticism, okay? If you have a look at those those statements about romanticism that I've included in the drawer, okay, the Blake resources, and we'll continue them for next week. I'll reprint them or repost them in the new drawer for next week. We'll have opportunity to go back to those on several occasions, okay, and see how some of these more abstract statements of what romanticism is, right, is very much related to what we're talking about right here with Blake. You know, it's this battle between the mind and the imagination, with the body on the side, the body in nature, and reality on the side of imagination, okay, on the side of that which is opposed to a hyper-rational, forging mind that is imposing all these ideas between you and how you really ought to be behaving, okay, and the truth of the world outside of you. So we'll get into all that a little bit even today, as you will see. So let's press on. So Blake hears the chain clinking every time he sees a chimney keeper or a chimney sweeper or a soldier, or hears a prostitute shriek. This is a sentence from the previous panel. Let's explain it. Well, indeed, according to S. Foster Damon, a great Blake prophet, or himself, or a great Blake critic, quote, "Prophets are not foretellers of future facts." What does it mean to be a prophet in Blake? Damon thinks Blakean prophets are not foretellers of future facts. They are revealers of eternal truths. When we think of prophecy, we think of somebody who foresees the future. It's not how Blake conceived of the prophet. He conceived of the prophet as one who saw the truth about what was happening right here around us in the immediate moment of our existence, okay, as opposed to someone looking ahead, dreaming of things to come, right? So prophets are, according to Blake, witnesses to, as well as revealers of, the reality of the present. They bear witness and they speak, and they're often angry because they see things they don't like. And we've already seen that in the case of London. It's kind of an angry, in some ways, you see that just to your left there. You see it somehow, it's something of an angry poem. You have a character in the poem who is crouching. Okay, this is in the drawing that you see over to your left, the illumination. Blake liked to draw. In fact, this is a big part of Blake, especially later on, but even early on. He was an illustrator, as it were, an engraver by trade. And he liked to create these visual analogs to his poems. He liked to create these plates. And you see one there to your left. This was the original form of publication of this poem, London. I want to call your attention in this moment to the crouching figure down below, who seems to be warming his or her hands. I think it's a boy, actually, or a young man, warming his hands at the fire. If you imagine that is, I put some stuff in the discussion drawer, or rather the drawer for week 1, okay, on the Great Fire of London, which Blake, speaking of bearing witness, he saw this great fire destroying everything. This wasn't even the great fire. This was a fire set by a bunch of rioters that he went and he saw. And I believe you could see that fire there with the young man warming his hands at this fire is somehow, I don't know, kind of getting his body is somehow profiting by way of this fire that's destroying all these terrible institutions that exist, in London at that time. So Blake was more or less on the side of the revolutionaries at this time, very early on. Later on, I think he achieved a more sophisticated position on these questions. But in any event, you see a certain approval of the prophet, or rather of a young man who is seeing things in the way that the prophet might, which is that in a way London is on fire. It should be. Okay. Yeah. Well, let's press on in some details of the poem here that might help us to understand a little bit more about Blake, right, and what the prophet sees, how the prophet sees, what the prophet hears, and how that matters. Okay. So here in London, now this is officially assigned for the second week, but you've already done a discussion board that addressed it, right? That asked you to encounter it. Not everybody did that item, but I think you've seen a lot of that poem. So this is not out of order bringing it up at this point. You're probably reading it as you begin to make your readings, begin to get your reading done for the second week, where it's officially assigned. Here in London, the poem, the prophet wandering London streets, right? As he says, I wander through each chartered street. That's how the poem begins. It's the speaker of the poem is this prophetic voice of this Blakean prophet figure, right? This prophet wandering London streets bears witness to the truth of what he sees, and again hears, not just what he sees, but what he hears. And I gave you a little bit of information on that and how that's built into the structure of the poem, that there's hearing going on as well as seeing, right? What does he hear and what does he see as he wanders? He bears witness to the truths of what he sees and what he hears, the truth of English life in that moment, right? Remember our definition of the prophet. The reality of the present moment is what he's seeing. And what does he see? He sees the truth of English life in that moment as forged or fashioned, okay? Mind forged manacles, forged or fashioned by church, palace, and more abstractly speaking, gentility, the marriage hearse, or speaking yet more abstractly, by religion, politics, and social ritual. So English religion of Blake's time, the late 18th century, English politics, okay, that's the palace, and English social ritual, which involves such social institutions as marriage. All three of these he felt had gone wrong, gone deeply, deeply wrong. And he wanted to blame the mind, that hyper-rational, rationalism of the Enlightenment, which was going on at this time. That's when he found responsible for it. And so he's very much an anti-Enlightenment thinker, especially early on. Okay, again, things get more complicated as his career proceeds. But let's get into some of the details here. Okay, take lines 10 and 11, for example. Note that he sees, quote, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. That is a very dense couple of lines, okay? Let's unpack them. What does he see as he wanders? But how proper churchgoers, constituents of, quote unquote, the church being its people, not its bricks and mortar, how they are appalled, okay, like disgusted or morally outraged, when encountering what is probably the dirty and certainly the coarse language of the sweepers out there crying and yelling God knows what in the street, right? That's what he sees. He sees something else as well. And I think he sees more powerfully and more prophetically, okay, not that superficial social conflict of, people walking to church and hearing some chimney sweepers maybe shout bad language at each other and being sort of appalled that these people exist in our world, right? He sees something else as well, and he feels something else as well, right? He also sees he feels how appalling or outrageous is that reaction of the churchgoers, right? He sees how appalling their being appalled by the chimney sweepers is. They are far more appalling than the chimney sweepers who are shouting out God knows what, right? Probably some who knows, might even be catcalling. Or probably not. It's probably what he's disgusted by, because we have some calling down below that has a sexual dimension to it a sexual dimension to it. I think rather what he's hearing is just like coarse language exchanged by people themselves disgusted perhaps, and beleaguered by their jobs and cursing it. They're probably cursing the work that they're doing, right? They're disgusted with it. He's disgusted by their disgust, right? What I should say is the disgust that the churchgoers feel in the face of the disgust of, you see how complicated this gets, in the face of the disgust expressed by the chimney sweepers with their jobs, the disgust they feel at this ungainliness and coarseness, he, the prophet, is disgusted by it. Now, why would that be the case? Well, clearly, right? The suggestion is that what the church folk in their finery are deploring in these moments are certain social facts. The fact that we have chimney sweepers who are degraded. Certain social facts whose existence they try to ignore, even as they help create those social facts, the conditions which give rise to those social facts, right? The poor amongst us whose kids become chimney sweepers, see the poem of the like title. We have one of those in both the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience. Note those poor amongst us whose kids become chimney sweepers. Hey, we depend upon them, we churchgoers, to keep our chimneys clean. The chimneys of the church, which dirties them, the chimney sweepers, right? As they go about cleaning our chimneys, they get physically dirty. They also get morally dirty. It's degrading work, and it sort of lowers their minds where they start calling out coarsely, cursing the work, cursing each other, and maybe even engaged in catcalling. Anyway, we degrade them and then deplore their degradation because we are, in fact, employing them to do this degrading job, right? And we're not paying them anything for doing it. And that's morally appalling. Then we, of course, turn around and say, why are they so nasty, these chimney sweepers, right? For the prophet, that's a morally appalling situation, that hypocrisy, okay? And he sees that, and he sees that it's all happening even as he speaks. That all-important word, the word blackening, notice how it's present progressive. The church is morally blackening, moment by moment, as this condition continues. Each blackening wall, every blackening church appalls. Okay, so it's happening in this present moment, to which the prophet has access, because he is, of course, interested in the reality of the present moment. That there's blackening going on. There's a blackening of the chimney sweepers by way of their contact with the interior of the chimneys that they're cleaning. There's a blackening of the air as you walk to church by all the nasty language they use because they hate their jobs. And nobody would not hate that job if you're stuck with it, right? And then there's the blackening of the church itself morally by way of its participation in the economic system, right? And its, willful ignorance of its own pretty church conditions, of course, being produced by people who have the workforce who don't exactly thrive as they do that work. Okay, so he sees all this, right? I want to argue that he also hears it. Rather, he hears what's behind all this hypocrisy. Remember this business about seeing and hearing up above. He hears what's behind all of this, all of what he can see, all this hypocrisy that's so visible to him, right, in his prophetic mode. And what does he hear that's behind it? And you're not probably going to be surprised to hear this, given what we've said before, right? The mind, that's what he hears, the origin of some very faulty thinking about life. Remember that those manacles are mind-forged. Certain thoughts manacle us. They're created by the mind. They make us, these thoughts, into hypocrites who cannot or will not see the truth about our own conduct. What thoughts? Let me give you an example. I mean, it's what we're talking about, right? Pretty much. You're on your way to church. You see these pitiable objects of need who are economically depressed, right? And you think to yourself, this is how twisted it can get. Pity is good, right? As is charity. Okay, if so, I'm not going to let the sight of these people bug me too much, right? These very poor people like the homeless hanging out on the street. And I'm talking about the homeless who are there due to economic need as opposed to, although even the ones who are there because there might be mental troubles or may have been driven so by economic need or may have it exacerbated, right? Well, if we're aware that, right, that pity is good and charity is good, then we shouldn't be too worried when there are objects of pity and charity. Because after all, how can you have pity and charity if you don't have objects who need to receive pity and charity? Pity and charity would be gone. Do you want to live in a world in which there's no pity and no charity? You see how twisted this is, right? Uh, don't address the conditions that make them need charity. Just dispense a little bit of charity, which doesn't really cost you that much, right? A 10 spot now and then to make you feel a little bit better about your situation, because you don't really go along with your own hypocrisy, right? Do you see how this works? We wouldn't want to remove the conditions that would produce the need for charity, because if we did so, we'd be getting rid of charity, because there'd be no need for charity. You see how twisted that thinking is? And who would want to get rid of charity? What, you want to live in a world where there isn't any charity? And you can answer, Blake would answer, no, I want to live in a world in which, yeah, I do. I do want to live in a world in which there is no charity, but only because not because we don't feel for each other anymore, but because there's no need for charity. We don't need charity because, in fact, there are no objects of charity out there facing us. We walk to work or ride the train to work or what have you, right? You can see how this twisted thinking gives rise to a certain attitude towards the poor. Hey, they're part of God's plan, right? It's all part of God's plan. God believes in, He wants to give us opportunities to reach out to others. So we have to have people who need reaching out to. Don't feel too guilty about your own wealth or your own good mental health. Well, we're going to read a poem that's directly focused on this question, and especially on the question of how the mind produces these manacling thoughts that kind of, commit us to a very hypocritical kind of position on the world, right? And that poem that we're going to be reading for this week, you may have already read it, it's called The Human Abstract. More on London. Note the especially challenging final stanza in the details of the youthful harlots, Blast and Blight.
But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.
But what does it mean for anyone, and especially for a youthful harlot, but just anyone, to blast anything? Okay, it can mean lots of different things. What does it mean to blast the newborn infant's tear? A tear being blasted. And what's the connection between the youthful harlot and the infant's tear? This is all very mysterious, right? Blighting with plagues a marriage hearse is also a bit of a challenge. Well, let's turn to the critics. Why not? Rhodey and Kent, Blake critics to the rescue. The main problem in interpreting these lines, we suspect, they say, is in knowing what it means to blast a tear. Bloom is also aware of this. He's another commentator and is committed for wrestling with it, this difficulty. We take blast to mean predominantly to ruin, destroy, especially to ruin or destroy the bud, flower, or fruit of a plant. Like the blast a flower in the bud means to ruin it. Blast a flower, perhaps you could argue, would be to ruin the bud, ruin the flower in the bud, okay? When it was not fully developed, you would somehow be blasting it. You can imagine it as opposed to like blasting something with a pistol or a gun or something. This is maybe a slightly more archaic sense of blast, right? As they say, it should be noted here that blast in the sense of ruin may ultimately derive from the idea of a malignant wind, which I think is an archaic sense. But you could say the blasts of the wind, blasts of the storm, or what have you, if you see what I'm saying, right? And if you see what they're saying. But you see, either way, it destroys the vegetation by bringing disease. In this case, the infant is newly born as not a vegetable, but something newly created in the world of, right, the world in which things are organic, right, plants and also animals. But not blowing the plant to pieces, but being blasted, having its future kind of ruined somehow. So the harlot's curse may figuratively operate as a malignant wind that blasts and brings pestilence with it, only in a sense that it brings disease, not in a sense that it blows away or apart. Well, what does it mean to ruin or destroy a tear? Blake could very well have in mind the effects, this is a bit grotesque, of a particular venereal disease, all right? Drop down to the red down below. Thus, the child's tears appear to be quite literally blasted. They have been changed to pus. He works through, the critics there, they work through this connection, and you can have a look at this. I mean, it's really very kind of disgusting and very material and corporeal, as I was saying before. But if you can imagine that the child is born with blasted eyesight, that's the whole business with the tear, and the child might lose his or her sight, okay, as a consequence of this curse offered by the youthful harlot. You can maybe make a little bit of sense of how this might work. Again, it's very indirect, and it's very complex and compacted, the meaning in this line. And that's very much Blake, right? But the idea is that the youthful harlot has been turned to by the man in the marriage hearse, right? The new husband. The marriage hearse is this image that we have for the carriage, bringing perhaps the two newlyweds away from the wedding. And already the child who is going to be born has been blasted. His or her future has been ruined, of course, because the man in the young man, perhaps in the probably he's young, in the marriage hearse or carriage, has been frequenting this prostitute. Okay, and he ends up not marrying her, but he does get something from her, so to speak. He picks up a venereal disease from her that then ruins his children, hurts his children, so that the first child is born maybe without eyesight, right? So you can see that this is a critique, isn't it, of contemporary English prostitution, speaking of social institutions, right? And who is it who's going to these prostitutes but married men, right? And London was supposed to be a place of great, proliferating prostitution in the 19th century, the 18th century, what have you. There's a lot of prostitution going on in England at this time. At the same time that you had all this commitment to marriage, right? And perhaps this commitment to like chastity in marriage and whatnot. So the young men, maybe the young women as well, but let's focus on the young men who are traditionally those who would frequent prostitutes, right? This is what they do is they go about following the accepted social ritual, right? You and your wife don't have sex. Well, Blake thought that was very unnatural, and it was the imposition, the mind-forged manacle, limiting what you would do. It was just a bad idea about the proper way to conduct yourself as a young person, is forswear sex. It's not going to happen. This was the claim made by Blake. This was his premise. And so what does the young man who wants to be true to his young wife to be, what does he do? But he goes out and satisfies himself with a prostitute who happens to have, right, venereal disease, and he passes it on to the family. So this is a really horrible line. I think you would agree. But it's what Blake is up to here in this final stanza. Now, what about that second part, right? Blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Things aren't getting any less disturbing as we go on. Okay. As the critics say, through this new reading, we can better appreciate the skillful parallelism of the last two lines of the poem, the blasting and the blighting. Blake is moving from the immediate effects of the youthful harlot on the newborn baby, that's the blasting, to her more pervasive effects, the harlot's more pervasive effects on marriage in general. And do keep this in mind. I'll be saying it in a moment, but the real culprits here are the people who create the conditions which make prostitution work, make it profitable, and blight everything, blight themselves even, because they're the same people who are the rich people who hire marriage, wedding carriages to take them around, which are really wedding hearses, he's suggesting. And it's very dark bit of humor there on the part of Blake. Okay, so they're the ones behind the creation of youthful harlotry that ends up being resorted to, okay, by young men who've been denied a healthy expression of their physical needs, okay, and their physical desire. And of course, there's a lot of this directed towards women as well in other poems. Here, the focus seems to be on the young man, okay, and the whole institution, which is created, not just the young man. We don't blame him personally. We blame the institution that has taught him it's bad, the church that's taught him it's bad to express yourself physically, and taught his wife that as well. A lot of times it gets blamed in Blake. There's a little bit of double standard at times in Blake. It gets blamed. The situation gets blamed on the young woman. The man is likely enough. The young woman won't let him. He therefore turns to the prostitute, and you see it gets terrible effects downriver, downstream. Effects of all this that come back to hurt him, his wife, and even their progeny. But let's hear what the critics have to say. Blake is moving from the immediate effects of the youthful harlot on the newborn baby to her, the harlot's more pervasive effects on marriage in general. He's moving from the more concrete, more nearly literal blasting of the infant's tear, biological blasting, ruining of the infant's tear, where the tears are pussy. It's really grotesque as a sign of the acquisition. They're born, with venereal disease that the mother is caught from the husband who caught it from the youthful harlot. Moving from that, this more literal blasting to the more abstract, more symbolic blighting of marriage as an institution, right? Which, as you can see, marriage is ruined because the fruits of marriage are ruined. Everybody's diseased and the child is born blind. Marriage is ruined by, in fact, the institution of marriage itself, which entails that you don't have physical contact with your partner until after you've been married. You can see this is what Blake is. Blake is a free love proponent at this early point in his career. Okay. So let's go on. Blasting and blighting in general destroy vegetation. The two actions are linked with the BL alliteration. Blast, blurt. I blurt out blast. And, of course, blight. But blast refers particularly to the destruction of the bud, fruit of the flower of a plant. Blake thus uses it to refer to the actions of the harlot on the infant. Blight, as a verb, refers to destruction of the plant in general, they say. And blight as a noun refers to the baleful influence that destroys plants or prevents their blossom from setting. Okay, and so Blake uses it to refer to the destruction of marriage, the plant which produces the bud being the baby. The plant that produces it is the marriage. Okay, and there's not a setting. You see, this gets kind of complexly related to the vegetable vehicle of the metaphor here, but I think you get the larger point. That there's a problem with the plants, and therefore the fruit, it's a fruit of a poison tree, as we say. The legal profession says the tree, if the tree were not poisoned, the fruit would not be poisoned, but poisonous fruit due to the tree itself being poisoned, right? And the tree is blighted. The child's tears at least are blasted. The child is practically blasted altogether. So, as the critics go on, just as the harlot infects a child with venereal disease, the infant's tear, so in the last line of the poem, indirectly she does so, right? By way of the husband, by way of the wife, they get together, the kid is born. So in the last line of the poem, she more pervasively, with plagues, destroys marriage in general through venereal disease. I don't think it's just that, by the way, but let's go. Marriage hearse now becomes a dynamic symbol which fuses a number of suggested meanings. In the context of the poem, it can be read grammatically as an adjective. Okay. As an adjective modifying a noun, as a compound noun, each form having harmonious overtones. But let's look at the first case, right? As an adjective modifying a noun. In the first case, hearse is a description which interprets Blake's culture. It refers, and we're going to stick with just this first. It refers in general to the deadly condition of marriage, in that marriage for Blake is a restrictive institution, deadly in a spiritual sense, which actually fosters prostitution. This is a little bit, we've already seen this somewhat, so we're very well, we've already gotten this a little bit from what we've already said in interpreting the blast. The blight seems to be almost a part of it, a premise, right? As you begin to think of the implications of the word blast, you kind of imagine it. In fact, this is the product. It's a product of a blighted wedding and a blighted institution. Even the entire institution seems, as I've already suggested, actually fosters prostitution. So that curse that blights, you can see the original blighting influence is, in fact, whatever thinking was going on at the root of the problem. And I use the term root advisedly. And the root is, once again, we move outside of the organic at this moment, right? And we think of like the mind imposing something that is unnatural, or that's a sort of a very bad plan, blighting what could be a very healthy, a natural condition, and maybe by chartering it, right, and somehow making it much less than it could be, in fact, to say the least, right, if the ultimate product of it is blasted, right? Individual marriages are literally and physically deadly since the venereal disease is transferred to the whitened children. Marriage hearse also calls to mind, this is that second bit, we'll just read through it. The marriage coach, marriage is again spiritually dead, and the marriage bed, marriage is again physically deadly. Because there's every reason to imagine that when the young man and the young woman finally do lie down together on their wedding night, he's going to have had all this experience of an illicit kind that very well may affect his imagination and his mind when he is with his wife now. He may either expect that she be more like the prostitute, or in fact expect that she be less like the prostitute, depending on just how moral he is, right? Either way, her individuality is going to be denied, and one feels that maybe the marriage is not off on a good foot. Anyway, you can see how, can you not? Blake goes there. He's not afraid to talk about anything, and I don't think we can be afraid either. So what to do? What to do to avoid all that blasting and blighting? Well, the younger Blake feels it's really not that difficult to know what to do. You just cavort. You go play, sing, dance, open your eyes and ears and other senses to nature, to the real world as it exists outside of you and outside of the hyper-rational mind and beyond all those impositions of that same hyper-rational mind. All those rules and regulations, all those thou shalt nots, get back in touch with your body. Now, this is an item that you guys know something about at this point. A number of you responded to question number 2 here from the first week's discussion board, and you will see that I will be doing this week in and week out, is picking out 1 or 2, in some cases all 3 of the discussion questions, Qs 1, 2, or 3, and responding to them in the video, all right, the video micro lecture. This week, because this micro lecture has gone on long enough, especially over Labor Day weekend, that I don't want it to go on 45 minutes or something like that. I'm just going to go with question 2, all right? And we'll circle back and address those other 2 questions by another means. But Allie had this to say, okay, in response to question 2, which is the nature question, which you will recall. She wrote, in The Blossom, Blake personifies both sparrow and blossom in a scene of delight. Merry, merry sparrow under leaves so green. A happy blossom sees you swift as arrow. Nature here, Allie argues, pulses with vitality and affection, embodying innocence and play. And it's quite an alternative, I think you would agree, to the nastiness that we see in the city of London with all that blasting and blighting and blood running down walls. At least that's the truth of the situation. Here we have vitality and not death, and we have affection without hatred, and blighting and cursing and all the rest that we found in the other space that we read about this week, okay, and certainly we'll continue to read about in the coming week. Bridget wrote, quote, it is evident through his work that Blake has an affinity for the natural world, and we will see in the echoing green, which I've included there on the side in its original plate, the echoing green, Blake describes events in nature to be characterized with joy and happiness, such as the sun does arise and make happy the skies, as well as the birds of the bush sing louder around to the bell's cheerful sound. For Blake, Bridget continues, the natural world is like an idealistic paradise wherein, and this next part is important, everyone and everything plays happily with one another. And this is something a number of you mentioned. Allie up above, right, the merry, merry sparrow, a happy blossom sees the sparrow fly swift as an arrow. There's this attention, this happy and not predatory and not transactional, but happy and innocent and, kind of delighted participation of one element of nature with another that we find in these poems, right? Allie agrees. Blake's speaker of the echoing green perceives, quote, harmony in nature. The rising sun is said to make happy the skies, and the birds of the bush sing louder around to the bell's cheerful sound. We see a unison with nature. Allie, I'd probably say, given what you just said, in nature, but I think you're right. We see a human unison with nature that is beyond anything that's been said so far, at least anything beyond any quotation we have seen to support this claim yet. Some of you are going to touch upon that, right? Brianna says, Blake's views, not just unison inside nature, but unison of the human with nature, right, is Brianna's claim. Blake views nature as also something that works in tandem with humanity, something benevolent and beautiful. Blake writes in the echoing green, old John with white hair does laugh away care, sitting under the oak. Blake believes that even the plants in nature, like an old oak tree or like an old man, old John, are something to be enjoyed and cherished, and something that enjoy and cherish each other, okay, which is, I think, a point that's worth drawing out, and I think it's a point that you guys make as well, right? So I'm just reporting on what you are yourselves arguing, I think, aptly in this moment. Before exploring Blake's do's, which I think led her to a very interesting sense that there might be, even in these early poems, a more complex attitude towards nature than we are so far acknowledging in our discussion board recap here. Elizabeth concurs, noting how it, quote, is almost as if the grass and hills are appreciative of the children, playing on them in the lines, the little ones leaped and shouted and laughed, and all the hills echoed, which I think is aptly quoted, very nicely quoted, right? Yeah, again, we want to get into those do's, maybe not this week, maybe next week. Maybe we'll begin to get into the fact that we have 2 different kinds of do's some of the dews are maybe not so healthy. You want to get out of the natural world before they descend, and they are themselves natural, right? So maybe there's an element that's being recognized even this early on in Songs of Innocence, that nature does have another side. And that other side is, I think it's still preferable to anything that the mind produces, right? In opposition to nature, right? The manacles that it forges, there is this other side to nature that is maybe not quite so affirmative, right? Either of the human or of other objects in nature. And I'm thinking of a poem like The Tiger, which you're going to be reading very soon if you haven't already read it. So we'll get to that and we'll save what I see as Elizabeth's, that little wrinkle of complexity that she's opened up for us that we will be exploring very shortly. But again, let's circle back to London. As Alexis argues, quote, it doesn't seem as though Blake has an issue with nature itself, but more so the human mind. And I think that is a nice recap, a nice summary of, in fact, the position we're taking so far, and the position taken more largely by the Songs of Innocence before we get to the Songs of Experience, which we're now getting to, right? Even though we've read a couple of them and even talked about one of them a lot. We're going to see that explored in some of the other poems in the Songs of Experience. That, in fact, Blake does have an issue with nature itself, but definitely more so with the human mind. But he's not quite so sentimental and right about nature maybe as he may sound up to this point, because all you have to do is think about predatorial creatures in nature, and it doesn't seem to be quite so harmonious all of a sudden, right? I don't want you to think that Blake has got these rose-colored glasses on when it comes to nature. He does early on, but he's describing, he has all these speakers speaking in the Songs of Innocence. It's not his own position so much as it is the position of those who are in the world of innocence and who have not yet fallen into the world of experience, where we do run into things like tigers, right? So we're going to be exploring that as we move on next week. Kimberly gets the last word for this micro lecture. She quotes that same cryptic line from London, the mind forged manacles I hear. And she mentions that she takes this line to mean that the mentality of London is very depressing, along with how the restrictiveness of society, okay, or along with the restrictiveness of society. And indeed, that London mentality is what has created all that social, institutional restrictiveness. And we're going to be talking a lot about that. We already have begun to talk a little bit about it, haven't we? We're going to be talking more about it next week. And we'll especially focus on the poem, The Human Abstract, which is one of my favorite of his early poems. So that's enough for today. And once again, if one of your discussion responses is, if your discussion response was not spoken of, I think only 5 or 6 people today had theirs shared with the class as a whole. Don't sweat it. You will get plenty of attention over the course of the semester. And again, I'll be circling back to talk about some things in the other discussions and posting them as independent responses that are written out, not filmed. So onward.